Welcome everyone. I'm Kathy Bryson, CEO of the Melbourne Press Club. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking. They're acknowledging their elders past, present and emerging. Today's event is our first masterclass, How to Read a Budget. Our moderator today is Richard Willingham from the ABC and a board member of the Melbourne Press Club, who will be in conversation with Heidi Murphy from 3AW and Vice-President of the Melbourne Press Club, and Grant McArthur of the Herald Sun. Some information before we start. This event will run for about 1 hour. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and our moderator will include them in the conversation when we hear from our panellists. The chat function will only be used by our team to share any additional resources for you. I want to take this opportunity to welcome our members and our new guests and let you know about some upcoming events. Our book club event, Jane Harper in Conversation with Corrie Perkin, is on 25th of November. We have our final edit forum for the year, How to Land a Job in Journalism, on Thursday, the 26th of November. Soon to be announced, we have just confirmed John Cleese in Conversation with Michael Rowland on Monday, the 30th of November. On the 4th of December, we feature Laura Tingle with the quarterly essay. On the 8th of December, we have Minister Lily D'Ambrosio speaking about Victoria's energy future. And our final event for the year is on 16th of December is Professor Pat McGorry and Coroner John Kane speaking about the social and economic emotional toll of the pandemic. Details of all of these events are on our website and we urge you to book now. Before I introduce our speakers, a huge thanks to our sponsors and donors that have supported us through the year. Thomson Gear, Crown, Minter Ellison, Australia Post, Telstra, Victoria Government, Vic Health, TAC, Father Bob Maguire Foundation and the Judith Neilson Institute. Also a thanks to our media sponsors, 3AW, ABC, The Age, News 9, Channel 7, Herald Sun, 10 and Sky News. Drinks Trolley is kindly supporting our presentation of a small gift for our speakers today. We encourage you to take advantage of the special code MPC10 to support this small business that has been really innovative during COVID. Details will be provided for you in the chat function. It is now my very great honour to introduce our moderator today, Richard Willingham, as he introduces our panellists. Please enjoy today's webinar.
Thanks, Kathy, for that introduction. Just starting off, for a lot of journalists doing their budget for the first time, it can be quite a daunting day. Just a reminder that you'll get through it. There's just a lot of information to take in, and when the budget starts, you'll be seeing heaps and heaps of books handed out, and you might feel like you're expected to read all of them. But today, the three of us will try and help you understand where to look in these budget papers, about what makes a story, what things to look for, and what things they may be trying to hide. We're also now in a situation where the governments, federal and state, are announcing more and more of what's in their budgets ahead of time. I think we've already seen about $10 million worth of budget announcements so far. So which makes the importance of reading the budget papers even more important, because that's where some of the really good hidden stories are about government spending, maybe taxes going up, will start. When we're very lucky today to have both Heidi and Grant with us. They have a wealth of experience of budgets. I think we were talking just before that they may have even started doing budgets back in 2006. And just reiterate what Kathy said, we're here to help you guys all. So if you've got any questions, make sure you pop them in the question and answer section, and we'll try our best to answer them for you. We're going to throw first to Grant, and he's going to talk a little bit about what to do in the lead up to the budget to help you best prepare. And so I'll throw over to Grant now.
G'day. Hopefully the audio is coming through. I guess initially, probably a disclosure, I'm probably not as smart as half the people who go into the budget, so I generally try to get a pretty good idea of what's in there, or at least what I'm looking for before I go in. Very hard to make up on the run when you've got so many books in place. But I guess a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even a month before the budget is handed down, I think that's the best times. The government's obviously still redrafting the budget right up until a day or two before it's delivered. So it's a good idea to chat to your stakeholders, chat to sources, all the different people who may be on your round, or indeed the biggest kind of lobby groups in the state, in the federal perspective, depending on whether it's a state or a federal budget. But chat to them. Firstly, see if they're in talks with the government, whether they know what's likely to be in there, or at least if they've got a wish list on what they want to be in there. And if nothing else, that means you can arm yourself and go in with a wish list of things that gives you a head start, so you can look through and see if they're there or if they're not. Secondly, you may find that in the lead up to the budget, you call the government about some of those things. It might be a major project, it may be a tax initiative or something, but if you're hearing whispers that that's what they're looking at, you can call and ask, and you might have the inside running on it. As Richard said, they're increasingly dropping out a high proportion of the budget before it's ever announced. So if you already know something that's going to be in there, calling up in a week or two beforehand as they're announcing that might give you the inside on running on a pretty good story. The other thing to do is to make sure in those weeks beforehand that you are keeping track of all the different announcements that come out. It gives you an idea not only of what's already out there, so you don't waste time looking for that in the budget. It also gives you an indication of what's not in there. For instance, I'm health editor. It may be that they've announced the building of 2 new hospitals in the lead up to the budget. There might be a third one that you were thinking they were going to build, but because they've announced the other 2, there's probably not enough money in the kit bag to do that. So that gives you an indication of something that may not be in there, and another thing you need to look up when you go in there. I guess the next thing is on the day of the budget, drawing up that wish list of all the different things that you think might be in there, and taking that in there with you. As well as a list of all the things they have announced. And the other thing is to take in a copy of last year's budget. And that's pretty crucial, because there might be things that come up in this year's budget that you're not sure whether they've been announced or not previously, or it may be that the funding has changed in this year's budget, the papers that are in front of you that you collect on the day. If you've got last year's to refer, you might actually be able to see that they've cut money from a lot of those different programs. So I guess the other thing, when you go into the budget, one of the first things as Richard showed you some books there a moment ago that you get when you go in there, that's actually probably only about half of them. The package you get's bigger than your Christmas presents, probably less exciting. But I think one of the main things to do is to avoid looking at the press releases. You get a package of press releases, and you also get a copy of the Treasurer's speech. And on the surface, they can be a pretty good clue of what's going to be in there, but I find they can also dictate the way you read the budget and shape the message. So I always find you best to, although the temptation's there to look at them and use it almost as a cheat sheet for what might be in there and what might be interesting, you're probably best to leave those till last, because it can taint the way you read everything. So I'm on a round. I'm quite specific at the moment in terms of looking for health initiatives. So I probably find my best thing to do is to start with kind of the wish list, all the things I think are going to be in there or not, and to go through that. And there's 2 areas of the budget that particularly help with that. One is the thin book called the Budget Overview, and that's essentially the government, whichever it is, promoting itself, and it has all their big ticket items, all their biggest initiatives that they want to put front and centre. That will include some of those things you're most interested in, and it's not a bad starting off point. The other one I like is Budget Paper 3. It's a great summary. It has line items. I think we've got a slide of essentially that first page there. It's titled Asset Initiatives. That's a pretty typical page. That's from the Department of Health initiatives in last year's budget. And you can see the line items there. They're essentially everything they're going to fund in the budget, all their new initiatives or some of the initiatives that they're going to fund that are carried on from previous years are listed in Budget Paper 3. And if you look at that, there's essentially a budget item there for the top. One of the top ones is world-class, building a hospital for Frankston families. Another one is building Royal Children's Hospital expansion. So you can see the line items. When you then go through the next few pages, it has details of what each one is. So it may be things that are on your wish list and you can tick them off and say that's there, and it will then provide you with more details of exactly what they're going to fund, what it's going to include. And so that's a great way of finding out all the different things they're going to build and quickly getting across what the major things that are in there and also those that aren't in there. I guess the next thing to do is to look at the funding. If you look at that page there, you'll note that some of them have TBC or blank marks there. Can be very much worth looking through the other budget books, such as Budget Paper 4, to see if it has more detail, because you'll find a lot of them perhaps not funded exactly as they'd say. I guess the second thing to do, or actually if we go to the next slide, if that's possible, that's from later in Budget Paper 3, and that's much more detail on new initiatives they're going to fund. If you look there, there's one that says delivering a new Melton Hospital. That's, and then followed, by the Melton Hospital as well as dental programs for students. Those are from last year's budget. One of those, the Melton Hospital, is one of those things I was talking about speaking to stakeholders a month or so before the budget, chatting to one group who was very keen on saying they wanted to push for a Melton Hospital. At that point, we didn't think that was on the cards. In dealing with the government beforehand, we started realising that actually is going to be included in the budget. So that was then pre-announced before the budget, but with little detail. So then when it came time to the budget, that was one of the first things I looked at. Indeed, it was there. However, it was only funding for kind of a scoping project to see what what should be done. So the devil's in the detail to look. The other one mentioned there was free dental care for students. Again, that was something we didn't know much about, but it was quite a good program and something that we weren't going in there to see a lot of, but made for a really good story and helped a lot of families. So a really good thing to get out there that we perhaps didn't know before we went in there. And that's just found by going through the line items in Budget Paper 3, then looking up the details later in it, later in the project, in the papers rather. I guess the next thing after that is to look at those things that aren't there that you're expecting to see, and then probably cross-referencing that with Budget Paper 4, which has more of the financial details on how they're going to pay for everything. Again, you can just go through the line items on that. And after that, when you've really not found all the things you were looking for or expecting to see, that's when you go off to the side of the room and try to find one of the departmental or the ministerial advisors and say, where the hell is this? We thought we were going to see that, and checking that. I suppose the third thing I'd do after I've gone through my wish list and ticked everything off, this part takes longer, but it's probably a hell of a lot more fun, and that's going through perhaps more of Budget Paper 3, Budget Paper 4, and reading all of those line items and the details. And that's where you find the fun things. Some of them may be a lot smaller. They're not necessarily going to be $1 billion hospital, but it might be a program you'd never heard of. It might be like the dental program. It could be a clue to they might be doing an evaluation of a project that might only be $100,000, but by the fact that they're looking at that, they're building up a master plan to do a much bigger development in next year's budget. And if you go through and look at all of those small line items, you actually find some cracking information that the public's not going to get delivered to it before the budget, but can give you a pointer of where everything's going over the next year. And the next thing I'd encourage everyone to do when you're reading through those line items, such as were on the previous slide, some of them have a footnote. Anytime you see a footnote on anything in the budget, read it, because it's generally got an asterisk, and beside it, it will say money for this project is contingent on a matching contribution from the federal government. Or it may say that this project replaces a project from the previous one. Those are indications that, one, this may not actually happen. or it might be an indication of we've put our money up, but it may not happen for 5 years until somebody else puts money up. It may also be an indication that, yes, this is a new program, but we've axed 2 programs that were running and combined them into this one, so it may not be as good as it looks on paper. None of those things are ever going to be advertised in the budget. The trick is to read the footnotes, read the details, just to make sure of it. But you're probably best to do that only after you've gone through the big picture items and you've got all of that. Then look for the devil in the detail. And I suppose the next trick is to then go through and try to work out how they're going to pay for all of these big projects. And that's probably something Heidi can chat you through a bit better than I can.
Just trying to unmute myself and make it all work. Hello. My approach to budget is try to get a sense before I go in of what the story is going to be. A bit similar to what Grant was saying with talking to the stakeholders. You want to get a sense of what the story of the budget's going to be. Depending on where we're at in the 4-year cycle, one, it's delivering on promises, and that's where you get to check if everything's delivered against the promises that have been made in an election. Second and third year, that's normally where they'll put some revenue initiatives in, some ways to make money, or where they'll do some cuts, and they're looking there to make it pretty sexy for the 4th year of an election cycle, a budget cycle, which is war chest, lots of spending. This budget next week is going to be completely different to any of that. It will be, as we know, there's already 10 billion committed. There will be a lot more spending in there, as there has to be for the COVID recovery. So we already know from the Treasurer it'll be big spending, and we know it'll be really big debt. So it's a different sort of story going in. So what you'll be looking out for are projects that are delayed, projects where money's run out for them, reductions to revenue, taxation holes, all sorts of things. There'll be a lot of holes in this budget that needs to be plugged somehow, and that's what I guess Tim Pallas has been spending the last couple of months trying to figure out. It's got a huge line of credit coming in, 25 billion. So just how many of the big announcements that have been made over the last couple of weeks and will be over this coming week, how much of it comes out of that remains to be seen. So I know Richard held them up before, but yeah, these are your budget documents. I've got 5 of the books here. Yeah, 5. With a lot of sticky notes. My one bit of advice is always take sticky notes and highlighters in with you. As you step through, the first one is, the Treasurer's speech. You can look at that to find out, like as Grant said, what they're going to try to sell, what they want you to pay attention to, can direct you in, can point you in the right direction. Or if you're a broadcast journalist looking for a grab from the Treasurer's speech, you can certainly find it that way and cut yourself a bit of slack for after you get out of lockup. There is always a big folder or 2 of press releases. It's very tempting to go straight to those and look at them. The top one will be absolutely whatever. If there's a secret left in the budget, the top 1 or 2 will be that. If there's something specific that needs to be addressed, the top couple will be that as well. I do dive straight in though, and I normally pick budget paper number 5 to go to first because it's the finances the statement of finances. So this is where all the money is. This is where you'll go through some confusing columns with a lot of financial speak in them. But Will, if you're able to put up the first of my slides, you'll see there, the table of contents. Go to that, and as you go through, you can see there's financial statements by department. There'll be the taxation, the revenue, the tax expenditures, contingent liabilities, those sorts of things. You can go directly to those page references, but the first one that I normally go to is, just go to the next slide, Will, is the comprehensive operating statement. So don't be frightened by how that looks and all those numbers, but that's what I would first go to, and that tells you the taxation revenue. It tells you what they budgeted for, what they're expecting to have, or what they're expecting in this budget. Then there's estimates over the forward years. So they always put estimates in. It's called the forward estimates period for the next 3 years after this. You'll see there's taxation revenue there. That number at the top there, that's $24 billion, 24.3. It's interest revenue, dividends, those sorts of things. You go down to expenses from transactions, employee expenses. So that's, if you've heard the Public sector wage bill is blah. That's your number there. That's the public sector wage bill. I'd be expecting that to grow. Total revenue from transactions, most of the way up the page there, $71 billion. That's all the money coming in. And then the expenses from transactions is all the money going out. If you look about halfway down where it says net result from transactions, net operating balance, that's pretty much the surplus. So if you're looking for a surplus, that's where you'll find it. You can see it's in the positive in all of those years. If a number's in brackets, it's negative. Those are all the positives going forward. So they were banking on about $1 billion surplus for this budget. I assume that will disappear. Net results. Further down is the current bank balance, about halfway down. Over the page, I would then go to the estimated general government sector, the balance sheet. That runs you through down the bottom there under fiscal aggregates. That's your net debt figure. So if you're looking for that, go straight to that page, net debt, you scribble that number down, you look at it over the years ahead. Those numbers will be wildly different. They already are different in the financial update we've had so far. So scribble down those sorts of numbers. Those are your, headline numbers that I would normally go to first. And once I've got an idea of those sorts of things, I would do like Grant does, which is a deep dive into some of the others. The state capital program, that's all the big projects, all of them. Service delivery, that is one of my favourites, a bit like Grant's. That tells you all of the different spending targets, deliverables. If you're interested in a particular promise, that's where you go to find the detail, as Grant said. Budget paper, was that capital program? This is the one, where you'll find things like the suburban rail loop. If it's mentioned, it's a big capital program, that's where it will be. It'll have estimated expenditures, and it may well have estimated completion dates. One of my favourite things to look at is estimated completion dates, because they often move around quite a bit for good reason. I'm always particularly interested too in any things where there's an estimated completion date. Might be Q2 of a given year. If that is a Q2 of an election year, as in the second quarter of an election year, that's something they want to be cutting a ribbon on ahead of an election. They all do it. Just that's how you read those sorts of things. Tax revenue. I'll go back to revenue. How the funds are raised. This is back in budget paper number 5, the statement of finances, how funds are raised. So revenue, how the money's coming in. You can see there that's the tax page. So it's got their taxes on immovable property, land tax, fire services, property levy, congestion levy, metropolitan levy. All those are big numbers. Total taxes on property, $4.6 billion is what they're planning to bring in, or what they were budgeting for last year. Gambling taxes, I put this screen up because I thought these things will change a lot. Quite a few of these will change a lot. And about halfway down where it says land transfer duty, that's stamp duty, not the land tax up the top. When you're looking for a stamp duty figure, it's down there at land transfer duty. I always find that a particularly interesting page to look at because it shows what they're hoping to, what they're planning to bring in, what they're budgeting to bring in. And I would think in this year, a lot of that will change, particularly say electronic gaming machines when they had to be turned off for so much of this year. The casino racing will be interesting, vehicle registration, that sort of thing. And the one final slide I was going to show you, and please do put some questions in so we know that we're actually talking about the right things that you're interested in, is this revenue page. I just always like to know how much they're planning to make out of road safety camera fines, particularly on Neil Mitchell's program where I work. We are all often interested. Police on the spot fines, toll road evasion, those sorts of things. I always like to find little things like that.
I'll just pick up on a few things, what to do if you've got time, and also things to look for in the days after the budget. It's in budget paper number 3, service delivery. It goes through by every department and every program whether they've met certain KPIs. Even stuff like, I always look for the recidivism rate, how many people are returning to prison within 2 years, and there's usually a good story there where, are prisons making us safer, for example. And it's chock full of really good details about, how many parks have been, how many liquor license inspections have been. And that's stuff that if you've got time on the day and you're not doing the sort of general overview story, can be great. But they're also, it's sort of in the days afterwards, it's a really good place to get stories. There can be big stories, little stories, great stories for radio, great stories to follow up for TV and print as well. So it's a really good book to get your head around, but not one you need to really worry about on the actual day. The other thing, just picking up on some of the things that Heidi and Grant have mentioned, is when you're looking through the line items of every individual thing, sometimes the government will talk about $2 billion for suburban rail loop, for example. But when you actually go through the figures, most of that money may be well off in the forward estimate. So they're trying to get a bit of a sugar hit, but the actual money is not going to start flowing for a long time and will generally change. So it's, as Heidi mentioned earlier about completion dates, if you look at some of those things that have already been announced, you just see where they're putting the money and when the money's starting to flow. I think there was a really good example. I think the federal government in their budget a couple of years ago talked about a $15 billion infrastructure spend for Victoria. But if you looked at all the money, most of it was actually coming after the forward estimates. So you've just got to, it's a good way to sort of go behind the spin, if you like, and find out, when these things are actually becoming reality, a bit like Heidi talking about those completion dates. So please if you've got any questions, please ask us. We're here to help.
I would say the point too that Grant made earlier is that, if you can't find something, usually in the budget lockup, there are all sorts of boffins from departments and media advisors who you've probably come across over the journey. Go over and ask them. It's the most fun in the world, picking, page 23 of BP4 and what does that line item mean. And if the brow is furrowed, it's normally great.
Heidi, we've got a question for you. You talked about revenue from fines. There's just a question about revenue for health and education. People would like to know what contributes to revenue for those portfolios, how that works out.
I think there is an explanation further. I'm just trying to find my right budget papers now. There is an explanation, I think, after it. Oh, no, there's... Wait, let me try another book. Hold on.
And I'll just, while Heidi's looking, some of the departments are often funded through general revenue too. So it's not just specific education raises money for education. It's just from the general revenue. So that's something to also keep in mind.
Well, actually, that's something worth looking at when you go through sometimes there is no amount given and it will just have an asterisk, which you look up and it actually says will be funded from general revenue, which is basically a note saying we haven't quite figured it out yet. We are going to do it. But those ones, particularly in an election year, become increasingly common.
There's also in the budget paper number 5, the statement of finances, towards the back is a list of the contingent assets and liabilities for the state. So that might sort of explain things that are before the court, things that the government and taxpayers may be exposed to. For example, the one I'm looking at talks about the Westgate Tunnel project and the ongoing litigation there and dealing with CityLink and what that means. So just there's always good things to check, and often they'll be linked back to a footnote that Grant mentioned earlier.
I'm still looking. I've read it. I just can't remember what it is. I know, say, the other revenue, education, it's from things like school fetes and parents' fees. I'm just not sure what the health one is.
A lot of that there'd be car parking would be part of it.
Right.
There would also be money that hospitals generate back from, say you go into a public hospital and you need some type of surgery, they'll say, do you have private health insurance? And if you say yes, they might then bill that and bill the money back rather than charging it on WEIS, which is the government funding. They'll charge it to the private health insurance and take revenue from one of the big health providers. That's money that hospitals generate. And that's becoming a much increased amount. The public hospitals are encouraged to do it, so that amount goes up each year. The only other thing is hospitals selling off assets can also go into there.
Grant, there's a question. How do you find funding amounts for a specific hospital over the forward estimates? Can you just talk us through that, please?
I can actually probably almost show you. Sorry, this isn't on a slide, but if you look, that one there, that's the forward estimates I've got circled for Footscray Hospital out of last year's. And it actually, get used to seeing that this year. That's just TBC, meaning that they'll figure that out later. But in the line items, it has pretty much budget paper 2 and budget paper 3 have these columns of money from last year's budget, money to be spent this year, and then in the next years of that cycle. So you always have the 5 columns. The first one can be very useful because you know it's not a new project if there was money committed last year. Then when you keep going out, you can quite often see it's like a Collingwood AFL contract where a hell of a lot of it's backdated past the next election, and it might get cut just like a Collingwood player as well. But
too many Collingwood references.
Well, but it's the same. It's the same sort of thing where you might have a government trying to sweet talk and they backdate what they're going to spend beyond the next election, which looks great, looks like they're building a lot. Will it actually get done? Depends if they come back in. But you know, so this is from budget paper 4, and again, this is you can see the different columns and where the money goes, and generally you'll see any new project, the first year's money may only be $100,000, $200,000 because generally that's money to do the scoping work, a master plan, and so on. And the big money kicks in a year or 2 down the track.
What's the footnote on that one, Grant? On the first one that you put up there, that you held up, there's a little footnote. What is that one?
This is for Monash Medical Centre expansion, and this is pretty typical, where there's a footnote that says this project has increased in cost from the previous year, but then there's a note saying that it's due to changes in the project scope. And you quite often see that where they will continue doing a project, governments of all persuasion, they've committed to doing a project in the previous budget or a year or 2 earlier, and as they've gone on, they've either scaled the project back to save money, or it might be that most likely there's a cost blowout, something that they promised would cost $300,000 now costs $1 million, and that's where you have to look at that. That's why it's vital to take in the previous year's budget paper, because if you see a footnote like that, you can go back and see what was promised the year before, and you can see for those blowouts. It's actually quite clear when you compare the two. All your major projects, it's always good to take a look from one budget paper to the next, because it's very easy just to take the 2 amounts at the end and see how much the blowout is.
Heidi, a question you might... Go on, Heidi.
Say, and then there's sometimes the major projects where they'll just have NFP next to it. That's not for publication. They haven't put a price on it. They don't want to tell us. It might be the commercial in confidence argument that it's going out to tender. So they don't want to tell prospective builders how much they're planning to spend on it. Anything that's got NFP next to it, I just make a mental note, make a physical note, and just keep trying to find out.
Yeah, and the word revised is code for either blowout or cut.
The question from Daniela, actually, Heidi might be able to answer this one, or both, Grant. Are there any clues in the budgets regarding potential sales of public infrastructure and buildings to raise revenue for future projects? So selling off assets. I'd imagine it would be falling under the other revenue in the Statement of Finances, which is budget paper 5. The one I've got in front of me doesn't have any of those sales, but...
No.
Do they sometimes earmark some for sale? And then where would you find it?
I suspect it would be a global amount under each department or each organisation, where it would essentially say we expect to recoup this amount, but it wouldn't have the individual things, because they would be
market sensitive,
subject to contract anyway.
Yeah, so they might estimate they might raise $500 million from sales of assets, but they might not specifically say what they are. I do recall a couple of years ago when they sold their share of Snowy Hydro. I think there was a bit of that was in the budget somewhere, but they sort of knew the price of that beforehand because that was a federal government scheme. I guess it's a question.
Sorry, one other thing would be in budget paper 2, the strategy and outlook 1. Don't know why I'm holding it up. They all look the same from that distance. That's where you'll find things like efficiencies. So efficiencies, I guess, could cover asset sales, but it's more when they're cutting things from departments or maintaining budget discipline, I believe, is the sort of word you want to use around it. Those sorts of efficiencies would be in strategy and outlook. It would just be a matter of looking at it, I think.
There's a question here about whether you're allowed to communicate with anyone at all while in lockup. You can talk to people in the lockup, but you're not meant to send out any messages, phone calls, emails.
Yeah. Do you remember, do they still take the phones away? I can't remember.
I don't take phones away.
Year. You have to have it all on airplane mode, yeah?
You have to sign something.
That says you won't.
Yeah, and then generally, as soon as it's 2:00 or as soon as the Treasurer speaks, everyone hits send on all their copy and off it goes.
Yeah, and quite frankly, it's nice not to have your phone ringing and be able to respond to emails for a change. The problem is it's a leap of faith because you can't check that what you're writing is right. That's why 2 minutes after you've sent it, you run up to every other outlet and ask them what they wrote and find hopefully you've all said the same thing.
See, this used to just be a problem for the broadcast media before all of the publications moved to online, and it would be the broadcast media. We would be walking around, I think in my first couple of budgets, you're just hovering next to the Treasurer's main person, waiting for the Treasurer to get up on their feet so you can burst out and file for that bulletin, because it would always be this close run adrenaline rush, like 10 or 15 minutes. Are we going to make it? Are we not? Then we realised you could probably pretty much write a holding piece based on the stuff that had been announced.
I guess on that note, how particularly you two, how have you seen the lockup? How's the lockup changed over the last few years? I'll be kind.
They don't serve beer during it anymore. Yeah.
I don't know if I ever had a beer there.
Windsor had beers one year I was there, I'm certain.
I was at the Windsor, I just can't remember the beer.
Yeah, it's hard. We know a lot more of it. It used to be the exception. You knew one or two key items before you went in. Nowadays, you probably know most of the big ticket items before you go in. You don't necessarily know the detail of how they're going to do it, exactly what's going to be delivered, but you know the general spaces they're looking. That's changed. That's become more and more apparent every year. More is dropped out beforehand. I'm not sure. I mean, you also know what type of budget it's going to be. As Heidi said, by the election cycle, that's going to be different this year. So you do have a pretty good idea what sort of a budget's going to be just on the 4-year cycle. Heidi, apart from the food seems to...
The food does, the food's quite nice. It's improved. I can't actually for the life of me. My first budget ever was at the Windsor, and I think it was 06. I think it was one of Brumby's budgets. And I can't actually remember the food at the Windsor, but yes, very nice. Fresh coffee's good. There's normally a nice selection of foods.
It's a nice view.
The view is outstanding.
It's a nice view these days. Got to make sure you take your extension cord or like a power board in with you, because there's not very many PowerPoints in the room and everybody wants to be on their laptop typing something.
The number of journalists has shrunk, which is very sad. It's actually one of the most, every year, it's actually one of the biggest snapshots to see how the industry is going by how many people are in the room. And it can be quite dire when you walk in these days if you saw what it was like 10 or 15 years ago.
Because you guys would normally come in with what? A couple of economics people, every rounds person?
We used to fill 2 tables. There's probably 10 at a table, and we used to fill 2. Then we went down to 1.5. I'm not sure where we're at the moment. But you see all the different outlets and everyone stakes out their territory. And then you see lots of books flying, and it feels like it's 100 degrees in the middle there when you're under pressure to keep typing. The best part is when you look over, you notice everyone else is in the same boat. Everyone's in a bit of a panic, and then it starts to ease an hour or two from the end.
There's a question there about how's it going to be different in COVID. I think the difference will be that there's just going to be less of us in there. The lockup, they are reducing numbers of journalists and producers allowed into into the place where it all happens, which is going to make all of our jobs a lot more difficult on the day, because depending on what you're covering, for someone like me, working for the ABC, it's a more broad brush about, lots of different items to tick off, whereas someone like Grant, who's a health specialist, he'll be looking mainly at those health issues. So it will be a pity if there's less rounds people in there, because it'll mean less coverage of that. But I think that's probably, unfortunately, the sad reality of the COVID year. But I would also means that we'll probably see stories for days afterwards too, perhaps scrutinising some of those decisions.
Yeah, that was great what you said earlier, Richard, about revisiting keeping the stories going well after is great. Like there's so much that you could actually just turn a line item into a story quite readily, but it does take going back, revising, going through the PTSD, rereading the thing. But if you put your right sticky note in the place, just have a flip through on a slow day and you can remind yourself of plenty of things.
Just on that COVID question, can I just say that there's probably a clue in the federal budget, which normally we all go up to Canberra and it's bigger than Texas. This year we had individual lockups in different outlets. So I was in the Herald Weekly Times building. We had a floor which was taken over by the Federal Department of Treasury. We had to sign in, go through security checks, then get escorted to our terminal where we were socially distanced, so it was only every few terminals was there allowed to be somebody on it. We had a certain lockup. There were Treasury officials roaming. For a start, there was fewer of us, but also it meant we didn't have access to any of the experts to ask them and get feedback on what we were writing. It made it very hard to scrutinise things. We had to be much more broad brush because you just couldn't be certain of the detail of a lot of things.
And there's just a good reminder there too, for people who haven't been into a lockup before, there are unusually people there from the departments who you're actually allowed to talk to they actually are there to help. You don't have to be sort of secret squirrel about it. They are meant to be there to help. And you can often go around the spinners and just ask someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And it's quite refreshing, really. A question about, coming back to you, Heidi, how do you look for money where money has run out? It's a question. Part of the question is for tax revenue increases. That's in budget paper 5, I think.
That's the statement of finances. I would say
taxes will be going down this year.
Taxes will be going down, revenue will be going down, grants expenses will be going up. That's all sorts of things like your business support packages. A lot of numbers will move around, and you will see a lot of numbers that are in bold at the bottom of at the bottom of tables in brackets. And when they're in brackets, it means deficit. It means we're in the red. I don't actually know how the Treasurer will account for all of his line items against the money that's being borrowed. I would assume strategy and outlook, the budget paper number 2, that will step through a heap of things like the state of the economy. That's the book that you'll find the economic forecasts, the population growth or dropping off, the unemployment rate, the the consumer price index, the wage price index, those sorts of things. And there will be in there material about how much is having to be spent. I just don't know specifically where. I think strategy and outlook, budget paper number 2, will be the place where it'll be spelled out as clearly as it can be spelled out, I think.
The other thing to remember about this budget is it's late. It's unusual that it's so there's going to be accounting for what's already happened this financial year, not just what's coming. So normally it's done in May ahead.
I would say there's the financial statement from a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, the financial statement, which is the last financial year, that tells a whole different story to these budget papers that we're referring to today, just in terms of the numbers. If you have a chance to read that, it is available online, or at least have a flip through the first page or two. It'll just show you some of the places to go looking, the words or phrases to go looking for once you get these documents in lockup.
There's just a request from Ash Argoon to talk through just very simply what each budget paper does. Just hold it up and tell us what each one does. Budget paper 1 is the Treasurer's speech. That's pretty straightforward.
It's the really thin one.
Yeah.
And look, that can be good even at the end. If you do want to ignore it at the start, it is good to go back through after you've finished writing or broadcasting or preparing, just to make sure that you have actually picked up on the themes anyway. And it's a good revision.
And to get your quotes too.
And our budget paper 2 is the strategy and outlook. That's got things like, it's your big overview, it's got your debt figure, it's got your big numbers, it's got your projects and spending and commitments. It's got some of your budget discipline, your efficiencies, those sorts of things in that. It's got, your expenses outlooks, your forecasts. It's a pretty good sort of overall piece. It'll go through some of the things they've promised along the way, they being the government of the day, things like, building a better transport network for the future. We're continuing to invest, we're doing all these things. You can get an idea of a few projects from there that you then chase up in the later books. So that's your broad overview, actual numbers book that you could go to first.
Yeah. Three is the service delivery, like I was going through before, those tables I was showing. They've are broken into sections for each department. So if you're on a round, that's a great one because you can flip through 90% of it, go to your department or your area, and each department has a table at the start which lists all the line items of everything that is going to be funded in their niche, and then you can look up that detail. And budget paper 4 is a bit like that with more numbers.
Yeah,
and that number 3 also has the really good follow-up detail about what benchmarks the government are making or missing.
Yeah.
From everything from emergency management down to, what money they're spending at Parliament, number of visitors, etc., like that. So it's a good one that's a very good one for following up, I think.
This is the one I have most of my little notes in from when you're able to have a decent read through it. There are 2, when it's broken up by department, so you go specifically to your department, as Grant said. There is a page called Output Initiatives and there is a page called Asset Initiatives. That can get a little confusing because sometimes they're 2 lots of expenses for the same thing. If you're not sure, I would just go up to a minder around the corner of the room and say, this line item, sorry, is that the full price there?
And quite often, without wanting to scare anybody, there can be different costs or different. You might look at the budget overview and it says they're building something and it's going to cost $1 billion. Then when you look up the line item, it might say 1.2. Then you might look in budget paper 4 and it'll say 800,000. They tend to add things up differently, and one may be for the total project, one may have the master plan involved. You really have to be careful and look at it. None of those answers are going to be wrong, but the difference is if you're reporting in multiple ways to make sure you use the same figure for each format.
That's a question, not specifically about the actual budget books, but we've got a question about what's our advice to stakeholders who want to get their messages out during such a busy period and such a noisy period.
Do it before the budget. Don't think that anyone's going to have time to talk to you after the budget because we're all flat out. But if you can chat to somebody beforehand and say, we think this is going to be in the budget, or can you look for this? That way you will look for it, one, and you'll also be more likely to seek comment either way afterwards because it's something you're already aware of. You've got the background. But I wouldn't wait until after the budget and contact somebody for the first time. I'd be speaking to the different outlets in the lead up.
Yeah, I'd be saying what I'm expecting to see, what we need to see, what will happen to our industry, our particular lobby group if we don't get. And then the journal will go into the lockup and be looking for it specifically. There is traditionally a get-together of some key stakeholders at the back door of Parliament. I don't know if that will happen this year in COVID times, if there's access. There's normally a spot that some stakeholders will all gather for the sake of the TV cameras and radio broadcast journalists. And you just go, and they just go one after the other, and it's stakeholders will say a bunch of sentences. Sometimes they'll make it into the bulletins, make it into the broadcasts. Sometimes they might not. So probably don't try afterwards, as Grant said. Don't try to start getting involved then. Or if it is going to be after the budget's landed, wait a day or two and then pitch it up.
Especially if you're a stakeholder who's disappointed. Being our industry, we're more interested in people who've been wronged than people who are saying, what a great budget.
But if you speak straight after the budget, say you're talking in newspaper terms, you might only get that much because there's so much information, you're only going to get a little bit. If you wait a day, it might be the focus and you might get a hell of a lot more interest from all different formats of the media. But if you go straight away, you might only get a tiny bit. So you need to work out, do you want to get an immediate reaction or do you want to get a full reaction? And in which case, it's a very different scenario on whether you wait or you speak immediately.
I've got a question here about what's the best strategy for covering the budget if you're not in Melbourne from the regional areas. It's a very good question.
As in covering the subject matter, or the...
No, covering what? In the budget. Sorry, I misread the question. It's so looking for items that's specific to regions. It's just like looking for hospitals. It's all in there. There is the Department of Regional Development and Agriculture. So that's areas that are obviously more of interest to regional people. So that's areas to look at there too. But
can I also say they put out last year and most years, and I've got it here. So last year, aside from just the budget papers, they did have 2 booklets. One was budget information. They had one that was particular to suburbans, and then they had another one for rural and regional. So basically they've got cheat sheets with a list of suburban and regional things. Obviously they're only going to put in the things that are positive for them, but they do have those. And the point is to look at that, then that gives you a pointer on where to look in the budget papers themselves.
Or specifically, if you know that your local area needs a hospital or needs a train station, or there's a school. Budget paper number 4 is the state capital program. Say you're waiting on spending for the Warragul Regional College, promised in 2016-17. It's in the Department of Education and Training as a line item inside the capital programs. It would just be having a list of the things I want to find and where I'm going to find them. And if they're money for capital outlay, or if they've been a big election commitment that is just dragging on and on and on, it'll be in one of the different papers, different booklets, but you'll have to go and just chase it up by name. So all of these budget papers do go by department. You'll just have to go to that department, go look through for that line item. If it's not there, go a few more pages, go right to the end of the section. And if it's still not there, ask somebody what's happened to it, where is it? Or you've got yourself a story, it's not there, and that's a big oversight.
Time for one more question, but just one other thing to remember, to try and familiarise yourself with the budget papers. Now, if you don't have access to the books, they're already all online from previous years. So I think it's budget.gov, treasury.vic.gov.au, and they're all there to have a look. And it's really worth just skimming through them if you are covering the budget on the day or in the days after, just to familiarise yourself with those books. Otherwise, I think we're almost out of time. I'd like to thank Heidi and Grant for being part of this panel, and I hope it was all helpful for everyone.
I say good luck, don't be frightened, always check the footnotes.
Yeah, and ask questions. If you can't find something, find a department person and say, where on earth do I find this? They'll always tell you.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.